Hey guys, and welcome to another video. This one is something that I feel a lot of people can take a lot from, they could benefit from. This video is going to be on understanding how DPS works in this game and what you can do to increase your DPS and things you should avoid, or things that you probably don't know, or not probably don't know, things you might not know. And really, it's just to help people be less frustrated with the whole gaining damage process. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to go about this, but I am going to try to break this down as much as I possibly can. So let's get into this thing. Okay, let's start with something that I see people constantly do, and it's nothing but detrimental. And I like to think of this the same way people, when they're trying to lose weight, get hyper-focused on a single number. They only care about that number on the scale. They don't care if they're putting on muscle. They don't care if they're getting in better shape. They don't care if they feel better. They only care about that number on the scale. And when it comes to this game, people get that same hyper-focus on this number right here, your damage on the rune board. And this number is probably the single most unreliable number in this game. And I'm going to talk about why and why you should stop looking at this number at all. I have not looked at this number. People say, oh, what's your thing on there? It doesn't matter because it's not a good number. It's not reliable. And it doesn't encompass all of the things. So first, the biggest thing about this number is that, like I just said, it doesn't encompass everything. If you have active buffs that only come on at certain times, or if you have skills that only affect or damage increases that are only active when an enemy is burning or frozen or poisoned, those aren't going to show up here. Okay, and it's not going to give you an accurate representation. If you have something that boosts your crit when you've used a move skill, or if you've used a mana pod, or any of that, it's not going to show up here. This is a terrible, terrible metric to look at your overall, okay? For so many reasons. And I want to try to break down, again, talk about some of those reasons. So things like, I have spot weakness, okay, on this skill. And its damage is based on how close I am to the enemy. So this, if I take this off, it doesn't change my number hardly at all. But this puts a huge amount of damage out. But it's not visible on this number. Okay? Things like this number is not showing with my... where's my seal? I don't know where things are. My seal of condensed elements isn't getting shown on here. And when I see people like, oh, I changed these two, and this made this number go up, but I'm doing less damage. Yeah, don't look at this number. Is really the long and the short of it. This number is notoriously unreliable and isn't affected by so many things. Okay, so my first note when it comes to damage in general is stop looking at this number. Well, what number should we look at instead? How should we know what our damage is? Let's go to the next section. Okay, this number is probably the best metric for your damage and what it means to you as a player. Now, with that said, this, much like the other number, is not the end-all, be-all when it comes to damage. This is a great way to tell how you're going to be doing overall, but it is not something you should only focus on. There are more things at play than just this number. And the reason that your damage area, and I'm going to go into it more, or your, what is this area? I don't even know what this place is called. The practice area, or whatever it's called. The reason that this number, much like the other, isn't a super good metric of your overall performance is that this lets you have perfect circumstances. And people only care about this number. They're like, my damage sheet says this. But there's a lot of stuff that is working in your favor, and because of that, this number isn't accurate either. So now let's look at what generally you should do. This is for everyone who's playing. If you're trying to figure out your damage, the only number that really matters when it comes to that, okay, hit this gear here, okay, you're going to put one target, you're going to put Unstable Serpens, find it in the list, favorite it so that you can get to it every time. I see people using things like, what is it, the Sea Parasite Beast? No, that's not it. Oops, that's, geez, I'm hitting all the wrong. Like Lunchembra or whatever. Because they're huge targets and you can get more hits. But most enemies aren't these huge things. You're not going to get that kind of overlap. You want a target, okay, that is generally the same size as most of the enemies, which Unstable Serpens is. It also needs to be a boss creature because they have higher resistances and other things playing for them, and those are the things that you're going to have trouble killing. Who cares what you can do to a trash mob, because you're going to burn your way through millions of those. It's the big stuff that you're going to need to worry about. It's the bosses, the curse monsters, the champions, okay? So testing against anything that isn't that is going to be worthless. So, use the gear, single target, Unstable Serpens, and always max level. You can get a much higher number by putting a lower monster, but it's not going to give you an accurate representation of your damage, because you're going to be hitting more, because the higher an enemy is, the lower your hit rate is against that. It affects crit rate, it affects penetration, it affects a whole lot of things, okay? So fighting anything under a boss monster, okay, so a red named monster that is average size, which is very important, which is why I use Serpens, and 160. Always do that. Now, again, this isn't a perfect representation of the values that you're going to get, for the same reasons that the rune board isn't an accurate representation of your actual performance. On my rune board, again, like I said, I have spot weakness, and the closer I am to an enemy, the more damage I'm going to do. But I'm not always going to be in perfect position directly up against an enemy doing optimal damage. Sometimes you're not going to be anywhere near that enemy. Sometimes you're going to be halfway across the damn map. Things like your area of effect. You're only going to hit them with one of the three. Like in my case, I have multiple projectiles. I might only hit them with one of the three. But in this case, because I can just plop myself up against the enemy and blast the shit out of it, I'm going to be doing optimal damage every single time. And I'm going to be using my attack enhance every single time it comes up right away. It's going to give me absolute maximum output. You're not going to have to worry about losing damage to moving. You're not going to have to worry about losing damage to curses or debuffs or anything. This is going to give you a perfect value. So this number isn't super accurate either. Because if you are susceptible to certain things, you are going to lose damage. If you, as a player, are getting stunned a lot, okay, that's going to factor into your damage in maps, in where it counts. So if you're going to be doing damage tests, which I absolutely recommend you do, those are the values you should use. Now, when you do a damage test, one of the other things that people ignore is your crit rate. They will go in here, and again, this is why I'm talking about these values. They will come in here and go to their, oh, where's my spell crit rate? There's my spell critical rate. It's 86%. That's what it is, and that's how much it is. But do you have other things that are affected by that? Do you have something in your zodiac or in your gear or whatnot that will affect your crit rate based on something? Okay, so there's no way to know that your damage is 86% critical rate unless you do a damage test. We're going to do that now. I'm just going to turn on the thing. We're going to sit here and hang out for a minute, and we're going to watch. Now, I recommend when you're doing damage tests, unless you're trying to find out your absolute maximum values of things, the fewer things you can do, the better for your overall knowledge. Again, because otherwise you're going to get skewed values because you took a little longer to activate this and you might have got an extra cycle or something. So the best way to do it is just with all your buffs activated, no potions, no anything else, no guild buffs, because you want to know your base values. So we're going to sit here, we got 20 seconds, and we're going to look at my hit rate, we're going to look at my crit rate, and I'm going to, because some people don't know how to do basic math, I'm going to give you a super quick lesson on how to figure out percentages so that you can do it yourself. I know some of you are going to be like, Jesus, really? People don't know this? Yeah, people don't. So we're going to go through it. Okay. So without any of my potions, without any of my guild buffs, without any of my attack enhance, here are my two values. So the first one is you want to look at your strike count versus your hit count. Okay, so I have 3,000 strikes, 3,000 hits, 668 strikes, 668 hits. I have 100% hit rate at 160. So I don't have to worry about hit rate. Cool, we got one thing out of the way. Now we look at the crit rate. Okay, hit count versus crit count. So I have 3,006 hits. I have 2,606 crits, which means I missed 400 crits. How to figure out what your percentage is, and again, this might be exactly what's on your sheet, or if you have other things at play, this number will be different, and this is the number you should be looking at, not the one on the sheet, unless you know that you don't have other sources of crit like I do currently. So this is really, really easy to do. How to figure out? Take the big number, or the small number, sorry, 2,606, and divide it by the big number, okay, and then times it by 100. 86.6%, which is exactly what my sheet said. So the first three numbers are your percentage. That's how you do percentages. And you can do the same for your hit count to know how much you're missing. But that's your crit. That's the value that matters. Now, again, if you had something that activates and you get extra crit when an enemy's on fire or whatever the thing is, it will show up here. And that will give you an accurate value as opposed to just going by the sheet. Other damage things that that people don't look at correctly, they come in to their attack and they look at their cast speed or their thing. My cast speed is 3.14 base, but that doesn't count things that are equipped to your skill. So in my case, I have quick cast, so that's going to give me a lot of cast speed. So my base attack speed is 3.41. But with my thing on, I am at cast speed 5.0. That's an important thing to know. Your arm or your penetrations are other things that come into account. Again, if you have max penetration, okay, and something gives you extra penetration based on a value, you don't need to have maximum because you're just wasting that value. Just like having 100% crit and then adding more crit rate isn't going to help you at all. The same thing with attack speed, the same thing with penetrations, the same thing with dodge rate and armor. Once they hit those soft caps, they're not going to be useful anymore. Okay, now that we've talked about how to find out what your good values are, okay, and again, this is not a perfectly accurate representation of your overall damage in combat, but this is a pretty good value, and it is significantly better than ever looking at your rune board. When people tell me they do X number of damage on here, I'm just like, no, do it. Okay, let's move on to the next thing, which is actually understanding what gives you damage and how the damage formula, at least to my best understanding, works. Okay, let's get over there. Okay, the damage itself. Now, damage is a very build-dependent thing. Some things are going to be critically important to one build and completely useless to other builds. Some examples are like a dot-based build, so a damage over time build can't benefit from critical rate. Dots can't crit. So where something would be super important to me as a crit user, a dot build wouldn't benefit from that at all. Or the difference between like a sentry build, which can't benefit from flat damage, whereas my build is very important to get flat damage. So I'm going to talk about just in general some of the things that are very, very important to your build, because I see people pick things in their builds and link runes and stuff that from a, from their standpoint is a very logical thing and would do good, but really isn't doing much. So one of the first things is flat damage. In most builds, getting your flat damage higher is going to be better. And you'll hear me talk about this in tons of my videos about how the more flat damage you have is the base of your pyramid. That is the number that all the other multipliers work off of. The more flat damage you have, the wider the base, the taller the pyramid, okay? So flat damage, you get it from your weapons, okay? Whether it's spell or attack, you get it from this value here, okay? And you can get it from modifiers like this that are plus thing with no percent symbol. Those are going to be very, very important to most builds, okay? Now, again, it's not going to be something you can stack for all builds, but it's something that's very important in general for most builds. So getting flat damage everywhere you can get flat damage is going to be very, very important to your build in most cases. Things that, aside from flat damage itself, that can do it are things like overpower effect, because overpower effect in itself gives you flat damage. If you look at overpower, the effect itself, it gives you main element plus this damage, and then if you increase that percent, it increases that value, giving you more damage. It also gives you penetration, which we will talk about. So flat damage is something that's very important to most builds, and in almost every case when people ask me what they should be doing, try to get flat damage. Now, there is one case when getting flat damage is not optimal, and that's in your rune board. If you look at something like, in my case, I'm using lightning damage, and if you went to the link rune for, what's it called, just added lightning damage, added lightning damage. Yes, it will give you additional lightning damage, but when it comes to link runes, you're going to be looking for something else, okay? Which is typically amped damage. Now, we'll talk about that separately, but this is pretty much the one time that this is not going to be optimal. I do all kinds of testing of doing one link rune versus another link rune and all kinds of things, and it's almost never going to be the additional lightning damage or additional physical or whatever. Now, early in the game, if you're just starting out, these can be very, very strong, and I absolutely recommend using them because you will have very few sources of flat damage, and these can be incredibly, incredibly strong early on. But once you get to the later parts of the game, these almost never end up being worth your time. So any source of flat damage you can get is going to be a very good thing, and you should try to get them in most builds. Next, we're going to talk about amp. Okay, I said I was going to talk about amp. We're not going to talk about amp. We're going to talk about attack speed or cast speed. Now, that's one thing right there. Keep in mind that those two values are separate. If you are a spell caster, if your skill says spell on it, it is a spell. Cast speed will make it attack faster, or cast faster. If it says attack, you need attack speed to make it attack faster. Okay, let's start there. Now, obviously, the more you can attack, the more damage you're going to get. Attack speed has a cap of 5.0. Okay, so you cannot go, your attack and cast speed can't go past 5 attacks a second. This is a value you should be trying very hard to get early on. Again, I'm generalizing. I'm sure there are builds that it isn't super optimal. I know my Sentry build is nowhere near the maximum attack speed, but that is a value you should try to get. Because it's a value that once you hit 5.0, you can now ignore that value. That is at its maximum, and it will make a big difference to your overall damage. And it's something that is not particularly hard to max out. And once it is maxed out, you don't have to worry about that value. It's very nice to have things like that. There are certain things that as you play, so like me, my lightning penetration is at its cap. I can't get any more lightning penetration. I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about my cast speed. I am just short of crit rate cap right now. Once I get my crit rate to cap, I don't have to worry about that value, and I can change things to put more into other stuff. So getting your cast speed or your attack speed to maximum as quickly as possible, or getting it at least into the high 4s, can make a huge difference to your damage overall without having to actually give you more damage. There's a lot of other reasons that having this at maximum can be good. For things like keeping effects. If you have an effect that is 10% chance on hit to do a whatever. If you're hitting 5 times a second, that means you're getting a 10% chance 5 times every second. And if you have things that hit multiple times, you can keep those effects up more often, and that's going to translate to more damage. Okay, let's move on to whatever the next section is. I'm not going to say because I don't know what it is yet. Okay, let's talk about percentage-based damage. We talked about flat damage and how it makes the big base. Percentage damage acts as a multiplier for that base damage. So it's very strong, and obviously the higher your flat damage, the more the percentage is going to affect it. And certain things can affect multiple things at once, so something like element damage is going to affect all the elements, and for the most part, the more narrow the focus is on something, the more it's going to give you. So if you have something that's not very broad, like damage, if it just says 50% damage, it's going to act as a multiplier for all of your damage the same way. But you're likely to get more out of something. The next like step would be physical or element damage. It's going to break it down. It suddenly cuts the field in half. But you'll get, instead of 50%, you'll maybe get 70%. And then the more narrow the focus, the more you're going to get. So next would be like the broader terms. Area damage, projectile damage, melee damage, whatever. Those will give you however much. And then if you go down even farther, down to specific ones, so lightning damage, fire damage, physical damage, those are going to likely give you more. It's not always true, but in most cases it is. So when you get to things like charms, okay, and something has a thing that says, you know, damage. Damage isn't going to give you as much as a more focused one. So damage is almost never going to be your best option. So if you look at something like my shield, it has 38% damage. It's the only thing I can get on shield that does damage, but if there was something that did element damage, that value would likely roll higher. Now, you can look at how much overall percentage you're gaining. If you go into your stats and you go to your damage type. So now, two things are going to affect this. If you're an attack, your attack damage plus whatever type is going to add up to your base. In my case, it's spell, so I take this value and that value, and that's what my base number is going to be. And then those percentages are going to go off of that. So I have 1685% lightning damage. So it takes the base value and multiplies it by 1685. And then the spell damage does the same thing that are based on spell, etc. Percentage is going to be something you're going to get a lot of, and you should try to get it, but it's almost always going to be surpassed by either flat damage or damage amp, which is something we're going to talk about next. Percentage is something you should look for in a lot of places, but almost always, if there is a choice between getting flat damage, percent damage, or damage amp, you should go for damage amp or flat damage in almost every case that it's available. Not to put down the importance of percentage-based damage, but because of how damage amp and that works, it's going to be generally better. Okay, that's the bulk of percent. Let's move on. Okay, now damage amp is probably one of the most important values in the game. And that's because damage amp multiplies your percentage and makes it's like the equivalent of what percentage does for flat, amp does for percent, and then percent does it for flat. So if you have a total of 100% damage and you get a 50% damage amp, you're not going to be doing 100% damage. You're going to be doing 150% extra damage on that base value. Amp works very, very well in almost every case, and when it comes to your link runes, that's generally the value you should be looking for the most, is the ones that are going to give you the most damage amplification. Again, not in every single case, but if you look at the runes that I'm currently using on my main character, aside from quick cast, we've got convert lightning damage, which has lightning damage amplification in 2 places. You look at spot weakness, damage amplification. You look at mana storm, damage amplification. Element damage amplification, has it right in the title. Strike, one of the biggest things is strike damage amplification. Concentrated area damage has damage amplification. Overflowing energy has damage amplification. These are going to make huge differences to your overall thing. And I see people take percentage-based things because the value looks bigger. Oh, I'm only going to get 5% damage amp, but I'm going to get 20% damage. That 20% damage in the grand scheme of things is nothing compared to 5% damage amp. And one of the values that I see people try to get, and they sort of don't think about it, is when you're talking about something like critical damage. Your critical damage, while strong, is going to be multiplied by all that amp. Critical. Okay, so spell critical damage, I'm at 966%, which is a ton. It's probably more than I need, realistically. But if I get amp, it's going to affect that. And I'll see people go with a link rune called Slaughter quite frequently, especially early on in the game. Because it's got a very high critical damage value, and they're like, I'm a crit build, I want that crit damage. Slaughter is arguably like one of the worst link runes that there is. It's so terrible, because even at its maximum, like let's go look at its absolute best, okay? So maxed out and level 45, it's going to give 83% critical damage, and then another 30% and 20% strike damage. So all in all, it's going to give 113% critical damage and 20% strike damage. And that's so little compared to looking at a different value like Mana Storm, okay? Which is going to give 23% strike damage amplification. And that damage amplification is so much more that's what you always want to be looking for in almost every single case. All of your link runes should be focused on damage amplification. It's very, very important. Now, I'm not saying don't get crit damage, don't get element damage or whatever, but don't take your link runes based on the largest values. Because how the overall thing works, you're not going to get more by putting something that just has the larger value. And I bring up Slaughter because almost every time someone asks me for help and they're using a crit build, they're super focused on getting crit damage, and while crit damage is important, it's not nearly as important as damage amplification. So when it comes, again, right down to it, damage amplification is probably one of the most important things. If you look at every single one of my link runes, they have damage amplification. If you look at almost all of my gear in places, I'm trying to find one, that, of course I can't find one. Damage amplification. You look on here, and no, I don't have it on there either. Of course I can't find any when I'm trying to talk about damage amplification. I swear they're on here. Anyways, damage amplification is very, very strong. It's something you should definitely not overlook. So now we're going to talk quickly about some of the named effects and how they affect your damage and why they're very important. Okay, let's talk penetration. Now, penetration works the same way it does with your character. You have resistances. Okay, so that means when an enemy hits you with a fire attack, if you have 75% fire resist, that means only 25% of that damage is actually making it to you. Obviously, it has to go through other things like your dampening and stuff, but that's how it works. Now, enemies have the same thing, especially when you're talking about bosses or elites or champions or curse monsters. They can have really high resistances. And what your penetration does is basically counteract that resistance. It's not exactly how it works, but for the point of how it works, that's effectively how it works. The more penetration you can get, the better, up to the soft cap. Now, the soft cap is at 60%. You can definitely get quite a bit higher than that if you force it with different zodiac things, but penetration is very important. The question becomes, how important is penetration versus damage? And it's entirely going to depend on your build. Some builds are not going to benefit from penetration as much. As you gain more penetration, it's sort of it does less. It's hard to explain. It's called diminishing returns. But for the most part, yes, you want to have as much penetration for the element that you're using, or the physical in the case of armor. Penetration is very important to overall damage. It's not something you should just ignore, especially when you're talking about fighting things like bosses, which are the things that you're going to have the most trouble with. So having a higher penetration is very good. There's a lot of sources of penetration, and finding the ones that work best for you are going to be very independent on the build. I get a lot of my penetration from my gloves. I get a lot of penetration from overpower effect. In fact, I get most of my penetration from overpower effect, depending on the build. So if we go to my hardcore character, and we look at where he's getting his penetration, almost all of my penetration comes from the skill itself. If we look at shield charge, and I get 80% damage penetration from the shield itself. I don't have to get damage penetration anywhere else, and I will get through 80% armor. I can't actually go, like, the soft cap is 60, so I actually have more penetration than is able, unless I gain it from other sources, which I am. Penetration is something that you should definitely not overlook, but again, it's not something you should be giving up a lot of other values to get. Your cast speed, your flat damage, your damage amp, those are all generally more important than penetration, but you should try to get your penetration up as much as possible. I forget what I was going to talk about next after the section that I just did that I forgot that I came back, but there's a whole wiggly wobbly timey-wimey thing going on. See you in the next section. Okay. So named effects, they're buffs, okay? For the most part are things that you're going to want, and I've done a few. I'm starting a new series where I'm going to take people's builds and help them improve it. And one of the first things I almost always see in novice players is they seem to ignore the specialty things. And I think that's because they don't realize how powerful, like, these named buff effects are. A couple of the ones you will constantly see in people's build, acceleration. It's going to give you attack speed, it's going to give you move speed. And then every time you gain effect increasing that, it's going to affect that. It might not seem like much, but move speed and attack speed or cast speed are both very important, and especially early on, getting acceleration can make a big difference to your overall damage. Overpower is probably one of... in most builds, Overpower is going to be the strongest named buff that you can get. It is really powerful in that it gives you flat damage and it gives you penetration, which is something I am going to go back and talk about in the section before this because I realized I forgot to talk about it just now. So Overpower, especially stacking Overpower effect, can be really, really strong. It's something that you should definitely not overlook. Some of the other ones that are very important are Sharpness. Early on, this can make a big difference. It's critical rate and critical damage. If you're a crit build, this can make a big difference. And then, again, anytime you gain Sharpness effect, it's going to affect this base number. Realization is good for barrier users. Gives you lots of regen. Knowledge gives you cast speed and damage. There are a lot of these, and people seem to overlook them, and I'm not quite sure why when it comes to rookie players. There's another... Uplift is another really good one. It's the same as the other one I just talked about that I can't remember the name of already. But these are things that you should definitely not overlook. They're very, very strong, and you should definitely try to get these. The trick with these becomes, where is the most efficient place to get them? A lot of people just get their buff things from the Zodiac, but you can also get them from certain relic effects or avatar effects. If here, so we got, where is it? Overcharge, okay, is one of the effects. So it'll give extra shock rate and extra lightning damage. And you could get that from here, or you could get that from elsewhere. You can get them on your necklace in a lot of cases with authority modifiers, so you can get things like chance to gain overpower. If you don't have access to it somewhere else, you can gain overpower in there, or the pain effect, or whatever the modifier is. So finding a good place to gain those effects, if you need them, can be very strong. The other trick is to not have them in multiple places. I see a lot of novice players when it comes to damage. They'll see that Overpower is very strong, so they'll take the Overpower Link rune, and they'll have it in here. But then they'll also have Overpower in their tree. Now, the effect itself can't overlap, but you can, in the case of something like Overpower, you can get things that are directly Overpower effect. Now, it's important to note that this does not give you Overpower. This just affects the percentage that Overpower gives you when you have it. So trying to not overlap the gaining of effects, but overlap the effects themselves, is a very strong way to do things. Named effects, again, you can get them from a lot of sources. You can get them from quite a few of the uniques. I can't think of one off the top of my head. Let's see if I can find one real quick. Oh, so there's acceleration on a dagger, which would stop you having to get it elsewhere. These named effects, in most cases, are very strong. You will generally see the higher end players having quite a few of these, whether it's Pulverize or it's, what is it, Hellfire. There's some really strong ones out there. Named effects can make a big difference overall, especially if you're going to stack the effect of that, like I have in this build with Overpower. I get a lot from it. I'm going to go back and talk about penetration, and then we're going to move on to the next section. Let's talk about crit rate. Since most builds are crit, or most of the strong builds are crit, let's talk about crit. getting your crit rate up so that you are hitting as many crits as possible is a very important thing. And in most cases, it's not particularly hard to reach max critical. Now, it used to be a flat number. It was nice and easy. You'd come in and you'd look at your stats and go down to your critical rate and go, okay, that needs to be at 760. With certain other things, in this case, I keep coming back to elaborate attack. This doesn't give an additive 10%. This gives 10%. So if your value is 106 and you add that, the value 106 isn't going to change. It's the percentage beside it that will change. Your critical rate gets affected by the monster level. So if you're fighting level 100 monsters, you might have 100% critical rate, but by the time you fight 140s, you're not going to have 100%. Getting critical rate up is very easy to do in a lot of ways, the biggest ones being your charms. The seal of crit chance is also very strong, and critical chance on rings, critical chance on a lot of other stuff. The biggest source of it is your weapon critical rate. And we're going to go back to my main character here. If you're talking about crit, this is the biggest, most important value, is the critical rate on the weapon itself. So this one has a baked-in value of 11, okay? And the gear critical rate, which if you're a crit build is likely going to be the most important modifier. This gear critical rate directly modifies the base critical rate of the weapon, and because of that, this gets affected by all of the other percentage-based, much like the flat damage and the percentage, so this will affect that. The other big thing when you're talking about crit rate is in your mastery. This enchant mastery, cut artery, gear critical rate, it's going to give 30% of that base value, which again is very, very strong. You can definitely get over 100% without too much trouble in certain builds, and then you can drop critical from other places to get more. Critical damage caps at 1300%, and you don't need to get anywhere near that, because much like penetration that I just talked about, it has diminishing returns. Getting above 7, 8, 900 crit rate, or crit damage, sorry, doesn't really give you a ton more. I'm not saying don't go for more critical damage, but it shouldn't be a focus. It shouldn't be something you're desperately trying to get, because you'll probably get more out of getting flat damage or damage amp. Critical is something that can get affected by a lot of things. Map modifiers can lower your critical rate. Enemies can have critical immunity, not immunity, critical dampening. So when it comes to crit, while it is very, very strong, don't narrow your focus on trying to get crit. You gotta expand. You gotta think about all the layers of it, trying to make it stronger. Now, one of the biggest advantages of crit versus what I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is double and triple maximize damage, is that you can use double and triple maximize damage. So you can have a critical hit that is also a double damage or a triple damage, which ends up with these huge, massive numbers, which is what you want when it comes to damage. Some builds, different skills and whatnot, won't allow you to do critical, so you're forced to use either other sources of damage. But if you can go critical, I generally recommend it. The one major downside of critical is that it's hard to get your critical rate up in the mid-game. So once you finish the story and you're fighting, I'm not sure what they are, like at level 105 monsters or something, your critical rate is probably going to be pretty good. But by the time you get to something like monster level 140, your critical rate is going to be really bad. You might only be hitting 30% critical, because you need a lot of sources of crit to do well. So again, I get spell crit on both of my rings. Every single one of my charms has critical rate. My star has critical rate. And getting all of these values together to get your crit rate and your crit damage up can be very difficult. So I typically don't recommend people start out crit. I recommend you start out maximized or double, triple damage, and then converting to crit once you get to a point. Now I'm saying this, and I practice what I preach. My character, my hardcore character here, while he's doing very, very well, he does not have enough critical rate, which I just showed. So his critical rate is 106 right now. It's actually 0 because I can't use crit. I've disabled crit, but that crit rate is so low that even though I plan to go crit, I am definitely not going to do anywhere near the amount of damage without getting my critical rate up. So until I can, I'm going to stick with maximized damage, which is what we're going to talk about now. Okay. Maximized damage. Now, maximized damage can confuse people because they will see modifiers like, have one? Tell me I have. So, like here, it'll say maximized damage, and they don't understand what that means. They don't realize that it is related to something, and they just think it's damage. Maximized damage is effectively critical damage for non-crit, and double and triple damage is effectively crit when it's not crit. It's strange that they've done this, but there's basically two types of crit. There's crit and there's maximized. Much like critical rate, you have maximized damage chance, and maximized damage chance it gives you chance for double and chance for triple. They are separate values. Obviously, you're going to want triple if you can get it. It is much harder to get, but it is something that you can get. The advantages of going non-crit, okay, so going with maximized early in the game, is that a lot of the modifiers on your gear that are suffixes, so the bottom ones, are going to be your element resists, your stats and stuff, and you're going to need those to get your resistances up to 75% so you could be safe. And critical, almost all the critical, so crit rate, crit damage, are all suffix. So they're going to take over those spots, and then your resistances are going to suffer. Early on, it's much easier to go maximized because there's very few modifiers you need to worry about to make maximized work well. As soon as you hit Act 5, you can get a rune called Persistence. Okay? It will disable your critical hit, but it'll give you a lot of strike damage amplification. And it can be very powerful early on, and you won't have to worry about thinking about your crit rates. This is going to just give you flat damage. It's going to give you that damage amp that you're looking for early on. Another good source early on that I'm currently using myself is Distorted Senses in the Trait 5 Zodiac. It's going to, again, disable your critical, but it's going to give you 30% damage amp. That's a lot of damage amp early on. There are other runes that you can get to help with your maximized. One is Smash. Okay, so as long as you are not doing criticals, since your crits are disabled anyway, you get a lot of damage amplification and a lot of maximized damage. And then there's the two link runes that are directly related to maximized. The maximized damage increase, which again affects your maximized damage, much like it would affect your crit damage in crit, and your maximized damage chance, which is going to give you more chance to do maximize. Obviously, these same things are available in a lot of other sources. If you look at my character right now, because I'm non-crit, I'm using an axe that gives me 5% double maximize and 10% triple maximize. I will be switching this when I switch to crit, but those are things that I am trying to get so that I can keep my resistances up, because this is a hardcore player, and I don't want to die, so I need those resistances until I can get them from other sources, and then I can switch to crit and start trying to do more damage. Not to say that maximized damage can't be very strong, but it is unless a build is specifically catered to it. Certain skills come with built-in double and triple maximized. Otherwise, it is very unlikely that maximized damage will ever reach the heights that critical will, because again, most cases you can use critical and maximized together. I do it on my main, and it's very, very effective. Is there anything else I want to talk about in terms of damage? I don't know. Let's go look, and then we'll, if not, I'll see you in the outro. I should probably talk about debuffs. Debuffs are exactly that. They're the opposite of a buff. Instead of making you stronger, it makes the enemy weaker in some way. Some of the very common ones are the shock effect, which just makes the enemy take more damage, and pain, which again makes the enemy take more damage. There are quite a few of these, and much like the named buffs, a lot of the time you get them in your Zodiac, so I will, hold on, let's see if I can, I know I have pain in here. So Pulverize is one of them. When an enemy is bleeding, I do more damage, and if we go over here, I'm gaining pain, so the enemies take more damage when I hit them. Debuffs can be very powerful, and trying to get them can definitely help your build, especially in terms of shock, but it is hard sometimes, depending on the build, trying to find ways to shoehorn them in, and sometimes in the process of shoehorning them in to make them fit, you're going to lose too much else that it won't be effective. It is something you should definitely keep an eye on. There are tons and tons of different debuffs you can get that make enemies take more damage. There's vulnerability and pain and whatnot from different sources, and they're all going to be strong, and finding ways to have them and keep them on enemies, whether it's curses or whatnot, it's hard to do, but they're definitely something you should not overlook. They're definitely, I would say, a more advanced thing, and they're not something you should necessarily be trying to put into a build unless you sort of know what you're doing, unless it's built into the build itself. So this build gets pain very easily, but getting shock effect has been a bit of a pain for me, and I'm not quite getting what I want out of it. But there are a lot of debuffs that you should definitely keep an eye on. Okay, I think that's it now. Let's find out. See you in the next section. Oh, so I forgot a section, and this is something I want to talk about because it's unknown to a lot of people. The game has a sort of throttling mechanism when it comes to debuffs, and it's related to frame rate. Now, the max frame rate you can set naturally in this game is 120, and ideally you want your frame rate to be as close to that as possible. It doesn't make too much of a difference. Down to about, from 120 down to about 60 is negligible difference. But I want to show the difference between me doing a damage test on mobile and me doing a damage test on here, on the PC. Because the frame rate on here is significantly lower, and that is directly going to affect your damage output. I know it sounds terrible, but that's just the way the game is built. So what we're going to do is I'm going to do a damage test on here and show the results, and then I'm going to do a damage test on my phone, and I'm going to show the results on there. I'm not actually going to show them. I'm just going to cut to the pictures because it would be silly for me to film that. But we're going to show the side by side and show how much of a damage drop it is. And I'm going to show this so that I can try to help people. If you're a mobile player, doing things, anything you can do to lower the graphic resolutions, lower the settings, anything that can get you a higher frame rate is likely going to get you more damage. Anyways, I'm going to run these tests real quick, and then I'm going to show the results. Okay, we're back after the 2 damage tests, and on the screen here you can see this is my PC damage test. Okay, and I got 16.4 billion DPS. Okay, the value itself doesn't matter, but now we're going to open up the other picture, okay, which is the mobile one. And you can see that I got, with exactly the same setup, with all the same everything, I got 14.3 billion. That is a 2 billion decrease because my frame rate is so much lower on my phone. It's not as bad on some people's phones. Now, I did an extreme test, just to clarify. I did this on, I turned the settings up. Okay, normally I don't play like this, but this is for players that play more or less exclusively mobile and they feel like they do less damage, because you do. Now, you can do a lot of different things to alleviate that. Okay, one, when you obviously turning the graphics, it's a different looking menu, but turning the graphic resolutions and stuff down, turning the effects and stuff down, using the Vulkan shader or whatever, turning the stuff down will almost completely alleviate that problem on most phones, but it is something that I wanted to bring up. Now, the other end of this, and I do want to at least address this, if you use a program, okay, to let you go above the 120 frame rate cap, you can actually cheat the game into giving you more damage. Don't do this, okay? Don't do it. Because eventually, they're gonna catch on, okay? And they're going to ban you for it. Don't do it, okay? They're gonna know that you're doing something sketchy. Don't do it. So, keep your frame rate, obviously, if you can. My God, why are you so crazy right now? Keep your frame rate, ideally, as close as you can to 120. If you can. I have mine set to the limit of 120. On a PC, that is good. You won't have any trouble. On mobile, depending on your device, turning your graphics down can make a difference. It's not going to affect all mobile devices. It's not going to affect all computers. It's only if your frame rate really starts to drop below about 60 frames a second is where you start to really notice it. From 60 to 120, honestly, you're not really going to know. It's not going to make a difference in the DPS. But the lower you get, especially if you get down to like 20 frames a second, you can really, really notice a damage difference. Anyways, I just wanted to address that. Let's finish this video off. Man, does my hardcore character ever look goofy right now? Anyways, guys, there is sort of the breakdown of damage and some of the things that you should be paying attention to, or things that are not as important. And again, the whole bulk of this was because I constantly see people looking at their rune board damage and only thinking that that's, you know, I'm mad, my damage went down and I did this thing. You're looking at the wrong numbers. And again, when it comes right down to it, remember that damage is not everything. If your character is slow moving or is easy to kill or whatever, that damage isn't gonna matter. You don't necessarily, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going with a glass cannon build that is super, super powerful, but it does have its weaknesses, and don't get frustrated if you can't get your damage to go up. It can be a long process in some cases, trying to get the proper gear and the proper charms and worrying about zodiac stones. There's a lot to do in this game. There's a lot to get damage buffs from. There's your collection, there's your achievements, there's tons and tons of ways to gain damage, and sometimes it takes a while. Don't let it get to you. If you enjoy the game, keep playing. And I had mentioned earlier in the video that I am now starting a video series where I'm going to be taking viewers' builds that they feel like they're having trouble with, and I'm going to do breakdown videos of what I would change and why I would change them to help them progress. I'm going to be having a couple of those videos out in the next few days. If you are someone who would like me to take a look at your videos, let me know in the comments, and I will try to pick some out that I feel specifically need things. Generally, if I can talk to the person, whether it's through Discord or something, generally in chat, because I don't like voice chat, but if I can communicate with you while I work on your build, that's even better. But for now, I hope this damage video helps, and it helps you understand maybe where the weaknesses in your build lie, and hopefully it can help improve those. But for now, guys, I hope you're enjoying the new season. I guess it's not the new season at this point. It's halfway done. I hope you're enjoying Season 4, and I hope you enjoy the game, and I will see you in the next video.